year, as I begin my studies with the B'nai Mitzvah families, we study the origin of Judaism and we look at Abraham. We wonder, why him? Why then? What can we learn? We review how Abraham was the original monotheist and how, according to the Midrashim, rabbinic legend, it was Abraham that broke the idols in his father's shop. And we begin to wonder, what might have it meant to have had idols then, and what does it mean today? How do we take these messages of smashing idols into our lives? In thinking about this, I turn to this week's Parsha, Parshat Kedoshim, which deals with the notion of holiness. Not necessarily the holiness that we have been speaking about since the beginning of the book of Leviticus, which was focused on temple rituals and sacrifice, but rather on the holiness intrinsic in each person. In fact, in this week's Parsha, we are taught, as Michael shared, that we should not curse the deaf, put a stumbling block before the blind. We shouldn't take vengeance, and we should love our neighbor as ourselves. But there's one interesting line amidst all these practical and understandable verses that I'd like to explore this morning. Our Parsha teaches, Al tifnu ha'elilim ve'elohei masecha lo ta'asu lachem. Do not turn to idols or make molten gods for yourself. What was God afraid of? Did God think that we were going to start building idols right here in the middle of our sanctuary? Maybe at the time of the giving of the Torah, it was other gods. But what does that mean for us? What idols do we need to be wary of? The first part of our quest to answer this question can be found by looking at some of the other commandments in this week's Parsha. Like I mentioned earlier, the majority of the Parsha is dedicated to relationships between people, how we treat one another. There are the two verses that we're taught we should share the corners of our land, that we shouldn't pick our vineyards bare. Michael's analysis of this with Ruth and Naomi was nothing short of brilliant, and I loved how you brought it together. Rabbi Ismar Shorsh, the past chancellor of JTS, has a very interesting take on this. He says that this Parsha within our Torah is legislating a series of charitable acts that are quite unnatural, slightly utopian, and utterly unenforceable. You know what? He's totally right. No one is checking how much we give to the poor. No one is looking at whether or not we drop off food for the food pantry. No one is checking the corners of our fields. Yet that doesn't mean that we should stop encouraging or even commanding this behavior from ourselves. Just because something might seem unenforceable doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Similarly, in this week's Parsha, we are reminded of the importance of honoring our parents. As this weekend is Mother's Day, it's important to give a shout out to all the moms in the room. But really, do we need to legislate honor of our parents? In fact, we do. I hear a lot of the parents nodding. Now we recognize that we all have a responsibility to assist the vulnerable, not to help them to a point where they can never help themselves, but to make sure that they can pull themselves up in a non-embarrassing, in a dignified way. Think about this image of leaving the corners of the land for those in the community who need it. We must first walk away because we don't need to watch them take it, and they don't need to see us watching them. So maybe the answers to the idols that we shouldn't turn to are the idols of selfishness and greed. And if this is so, we need to make sure that we are behaving in ways that reflects this holy tradition. Most of us don't have actual fields where we would let the corners be for the poor, but we have the ability to bring food to the food pantry, to give time and money to those in our society who need it, to support those organizations that help the needy, and to be conscious about food. This week here in the synagogue, we started planning for Shavuot. And as we began making plans for our program, we determined that our program on Sunday night, June 9th, will be called From Farm to Synagogue. Using the same idea from farm to table, we will have an entire meal dedicated to locally grown food, which is sustainably raised. Why? Because this helps the environment, it helps the farms, and we will learn how much can be done, and we will celebrate the bringing of the first fruits on Shavuot. Several years ago, the Dalai Lama was at Colgate University when Dave was the university chaplain. Now, I don't always get my inspiration from other religious figures, but in this case, I was particularly moved because he said something that was so compatible with Judaism. He said that you need compassion, honesty, and the ability to see each other as a creation of God. Maybe those are the idols that we should be focusing on. Maybe there are other idols as well. Could it be that God was warning against total secularism? Maybe we should find ways to reconcile a commitment to a religious life and living in a modern world, dedicated to the history of science and philosophy and arts. This year alone, we've spent time engaged in this conversation as we began to explore the relationship between genetics and science. Finally, our Torah could be warning against the evils of extreme competition to the point of destruction. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't work hard, and it doesn't mean that people will end up in different positions of power. But when dealing with one another, we should compete with a sense of a good human spirit. We should find ways to agree to disagree. We should understand that change happens, but how they happen, how we talk, is important. We have two upcoming events at the synagogue which highlight this. The first is this Monday, where we welcome Fred Molad and Alexis Azria to see how Jewish culture in New York has evolved, and how, though we're in a different place than we were a century ago, we see the impact of how that happened. I'll never forget when Rick Kaminer was president of the congregation, he said to me, "You can't stay in the same place, because if you stay in the same place, you get left behind as everybody else keeps moving ahead." That is an important message. The second event coming up is our SPS Talks, how we will debate about how we educate about Israel, an important conversation in Israel's 71st year. Not easy questions, but ones that must be explored so that we don't destroy each other in the process. There are many idols that we must be wary of. During the conversation that I had with the B'nai Mitzvah families at the beginning of the year, after talking about Abraham, I asked them, what idols do they need to break as they think about what it means to become a bar or bat mitzvah, or living as a teenager in the 21st century? There are clearly issues that those of us who were not students in the 21st century did not have to deal with. The idea that it is our kids who are teaching us how to do active safety drills, the idea that it is our kids who are laying their lives on the line, reminds us that the idolatry towards guns of so many is something that we must be challenged by. And we must hold up the goodness of our students who are literally on the front lines. We need to remember that there are people in the world who are not living up to the standards of decency in their private lives, even if they might be successful in their chosen fields. Our bar and bat mitzvah students understood that we need to break the idol that focuses on external beauty as the only marker of beauty, or of physical appearance as the be-all and end-all of what is important. At first blush, it seems like this line in our parsha is one of the most obsolete, one of the most irrelevant, because we're not really making idols. But I hope that you will agree with me that we need to make sure that we don't turn to the idols that are highlighted in our society, and rather raise up the ideals and values that we can find right here in our tradition, whether they can be enforced or not. Shabbat Shalom, and Mazel Tov to Michael and his family.